We're gonna do something a little different here. I want to go through Solomon Zeitlin, the Dead Sea Scrolls in Modern Scholarship. When you read Solomon Zeitlin, you really got to take a lot of what he says with a grain of salt. He has a lot of really interesting information, and then he says things that are, I would say, very wrong. So I'm gonna go through his book here. Um, I recommend it, but like I said, there's a lot I would disagree with this guy, but we'll go through it. I'll leave something of a commentary as I read through it, but we'll start with the introduction. And hopefully I can read this better than I can read my own writing, so. Alright, introduction. And I can't even read the first word, so we're off to a great start. And we'll skip that word. An archaeologist says that the battle in the dating of the Dead Sea Scrolls has at times attained the status of veritable genre de servants. He also uses a lot of Latin, Greek, and uh, Hebrew words that I'm gonna butcher. So that's just another disclaimer here. But anyway, we'll continue. It is an outstanding chapter in the history of learning, in some ways without parallel. Indeed, it fell upon me to fire the first shot in this war. To have a full understanding of this logomarchy among the scholars, I set forth to follow causes and underlying reasons. In 1948, a worldwide sensation was created by the supposed discovery by Bedouin of ancient scrolls in a cave near the Dead Sea. These scrolls were dated by scholars as of the pre-Christian era. These scrolls were as follows: a commentary, or as it was later called, Midrash, on the book of Habakkuk, a complete Isaiah scroll, and another scroll which was later named the Manual of Discipline. An account was given of the discovery in the Biblical Archaeologists of September 1948. In the same number was printed a facsimile page of the commentary of Habakkuk. When I examined this facsimile, I noticed that the phrase Molch Zedek, teacher of righteousness, occurred in the commentary of Habakkuk. From general knowledge of the history of the Hebrew literature, it is known that this term had been coined in the Middle Ages. Hence, I immediately launched my criticism of the opinion that this scroll belonged to the pre-Christian period. I furthermore said that if the term teacher of righteousness had been in voyage in the pre-Christian period, and even if it had been used merely by the dissenting group, it would surely have penetrated into Jewish and early Christian literature. The word righteousness occurs frequently in the apocryphal literature, but the phrase teacher of righteousness is never found there. Jesus, for example, was called teacher or good teacher, but never teacher of righteousness. The use of this phrase in the commentary indicates clearly that it could not have been written in the pre-Christian period. I also pointed out that no commentaries on Midrashim were written on biblical books before the destruction of the Second Temple. To this, I added that other words and phrases found in the commentary of Habakkuk indicate clearly that it belongs to the Middle Ages, and that the author himself made use of the Targum of Jonathan, which itself is a compilation belonging to the Middle Ages. This was my first attack upon opinions of the scholars. The war, however, soon proved to be one-sided. The scholars have never answered me by refuting my arguments. And I'll add this. I never heard a good argument refuting what a lot of what Solomon Zeitlin says in his book. A lot of things you just have they just point to the carbon dating and it's all just dismissed what he has to say. And I've not heard a good refuting of any of his arguments. That's why I give a little more weight to what he has to say. Um, Also, one reason I'm reading through this book is to I've been having leanings that the Dead Sea Scrolls are Middle Ages. I wrote my book arguing that they date to second century or third century AD, but since publishing, people have been sending me more information that have my that that makes me think that it is it, that it's medieval. That's my personal belief as of right now. So that's why I want to go through Solomon Zeitlin again with this perspective to re-examine what he has to say. Because a lot of this, the first time I read it, I didn't give him a lot of uh I didn't believe a lot of what he had to say because I thought I wanted to believe the carbon dates, and I wrote my book trying to have a more to fit the anachronisms that are in the scrolls while trying to maintain the carbon dates, but I don't think that's even necessary. I don't think that carbon dates are legitimate. But we'll continue here with this book. Oh, where did I leave off? We'll start here. This was my first attack upon the opinions of the scholars. The war, however, soon proved to be one sided. The scholars have never answered me by refuting my arguments. The best they could contend was that possibly the terms were in use in the pre Christian period. This, to my mind, was an admission that they had not mastered the field of the history of Judaism and were not com- competently acquainted with competently acquainted with Hebrew literature. The American Schools of Oriental Research in 1950 published the Isaiah manuscript. It was acclaimed as of great importance, and it was stated that it would revolutionize our knowledge of the Bible. Some even maintain that this very scroll was the same book of Isaiah from which Jesus had read when in the synagogue at Nazareth. Another theologian ventured the opinion that John the Baptist might have handled this scroll of Isaiah. In one of his sermons, he declared, "Isn't it a wonderful thing that the oldest Old Testament record of the prophecy of Isaiah may have been handled by the herald of the Messiah?" The importance of the scroll, because of its great antiquity, was well advertised in popular writings as well as on the air. Again, after acclaiming the scroll, became convinced that it was not of great antiquity and hence was valueless for the history of the Hebrew Bible. And I would agree with that. The scribes who copied the scroll did not even know sufficient Hebrew and therefore committed gross errors. Not only letters, but even entire verses are missing. The fact that the Matrix Lectionis were used in the scroll of Isaiah indicates clearly that this scroll could not have been written in the pre-Christian period, since the Matrix Lectionis were introduced in the biblical books by the authority of our or Rabbi Akiva, who lived in the second century of our era. Even the physical appearance of the writing of this scroll indicates that it was written during the Middle Ages, when the scribes who copied it discovered he had made an error. He drew a line through the word to indicate that it was written by mistake, and he wrote the correct word above. The method of drawing a line through a letter or word to indicate that it was written by mistake came into voyage quite late. The the third scroll, the Manual of Discipline, was published by the American Schools of Oriental Research in 1951. This school, too, was heralded as one of the oldest documents which has come down to us from the pre Christian period. The commonly accepted opinion of the scholars was that it was a document of the Essenes because there are parallels between ideas held by them as stated by Josephus and those found in the scrolls. Some scholars were of the opinion that the scrolls would shed light on the origin and beginnings of Christianity, and therefore held that it was of great value both for the history of Second Jewish Commonwealth and the origins of Christianity. In rebuttal against the claimed antiquity of the scroll, I pointed out that phrases used and ideas recorded in it were not known before the destruction of the Second Temple. I also pointed out that the cardinal ideas of the Essenes, as well as those of Christians, were not referred to in it, such as immortality of the soul, reward and punishment after death, and resurrection. Even the physical writings even the physical writing of the scroll indicates that it was written during a late period. The author, in quoting a biblical verse, used ellipses to indicate the omission of a word. The practice of using ellipses to indicate that a word has been omitted came into usage quite late, and therefore proves another help to date this manuscript. It has been well recognized that the so-called Manual of Discipline shows great affinity with the Zedeckite fragments which were found in Cairo, Egypt, and were later published by Dr. Solomon Schechter. Sure I pronounced that right. It has been assumed that both were the works of the Essenes. I rejected this theory because in the scrolls we have halakot, Jewish laws which were enacted by the sages a long time after the destruction of the Second Temple. The three scrolls which the late Professor Stucknick bought from a merchant were published recently and included another Isaiah scroll, the scroll of hymns, and the scroll of the wars between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. The last scroll was considered very important because it was believed to be of Essene origin, and hence very important for the history of warfare between the Second Jewish Commonwealth. Again, I rejected this theory on the basis of internal evidence, since the laws therein referred to were not in voyage during the period of the Second Jewish Commonwealth, and we know definitely that they were enacted after the destruction of the Second Temple. All my arguments, which I based on unimpeachable proofs, were ignored and remain unrefuted. The reason for this, we may assume, is that silence was an easy way out. In this volume, I point out two things. The authors of the scrolls were semi-literate persons who did not know how to express themselves accurately in Hebrew, and, which is one of the reasons I think this also could be forgeries, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. And most of the modern scholars who dealt with the scrolls were unable to read the text correctly, hence their translations are faulty. Furthermore, they show a lack of knowledge of the history of Judaism with, uh, with its rich rabbinic and Quranic literature. Two other scrolls, supposedly discovered by Bedouin, were heralded by the press as of paramount importance for the history of the Jews. One was a phylactery, which it was claimed had been used by the men of the Bar Kokhba, and the second was a letter written by Bar Kokhba himself. In this volume, I show that this phylactery is according to the Babylonian tradition and belongs to the Middle Ages, and that the letter could not have been written by Bar Kokhba, since it begins with the preposition from, and a signature his title with his title appended. In antiquity, letters did not carry a signature at the end, and the title of the sender was placed in the beginning. No letter ever began with the preposition from. The scholars who maintain that the scrolls, I'm at this, a lot of things are dated based on the letter of Bar Kokhba for paleographic usage. For using paleography, you have to compare known dated manuscripts, and the Bar Kokhba letter is one of them. And I think Solomon also has something about the sale of Macau, where he refutes that one as well, which is another one that people point to as a reference for paleography, which just puts the entire question of paleography into question if you have medieval writings being compared to date manuscripts to ancient antiquity. But we'll continue here. The scholars who maintained that the scrolls had been written in the pre-Christian period based this contention on paleography and archaeology. Paleography, as I view it, cannot be a criterion on which to decide the antiquity of the scrolls, since there are no scrolls in existence dating from the pre-Christian period with which to compare the recently discovered manuscripts. This is also, he's writing this much earlier. There have been other discoveries, but I'd be very curious to see what he had to say on some things like the papyri and all that, but we'll continue here. I don't remember when he died or when this book was written, but it was like I think it was I want to say the 70s, but I might be wrong about that, but somewhere in that time frame. So I'm pretty sure he was dead before the carbon dates in the 1990s. I'm fairly certain of that, but let's continue. Paleography, as I view it, cannot be a criterion on which to decide the antiquity of the scrolls, since there are no scrolls in existence dating from the pre-Christian period with which to compare the recently discovered manuscripts. The views of Albright, Byram Barum, Cross and Trevor on Hebrew paleography cannot be considered scientific because they never undertook seriously the study of Hebrew orthography. One cannot deal with Hebrew paleography without first making a thorough study of Hebrew orthography. I appended herein a facsimile of a Babylonian manuscript of the early part of the 10th century of the Christian era. He also avoids Solomon. He avoids AD and BC because he's an idiot, but we'll continue on. Wherein some of the letters were written in the more archaic form than those in the scrolls. Archaeology cannot serve as a criterion for the antiquity of the scrolls. The 7 scrolls were not discovered by archaeologists. They did not actually see the scrolls wrapped in linen and secreted in jars. The accounts relating to the discovery itself of the scrolls are contradictory. I recount below the diverse and various accounts of the discovery which are indeed stranger than fiction. I deal also with the well-advertised test called carbon-14, and that's in reference to the Libby test. I don't remember when that was done, but it gave very broad dates of like 400 years between the points. So it's very early carbon dating. That's what he's going to be talking about when he brings that up, but we'll continue. The consensus of opinion among those who cling to the view that the scrolls belong to the pre-Christian period is that they were written by the Essenes. We shall demonstrate in this volume that this opinion must be discarded, since the ideas and laws set forth in the scrolls are in direct contradiction to those held by and promulgated, I can't say that, by the Essenes, or, as a matter of fact, by any Jewish group of the pre-Christian period. Many Christian scholars who have been devoting themselves to the study of the scrolls have maintained lately that they will revolutionize our knowledge of the beginnings of Christianity. Some have advanced the view that the teacher of righteousness was a prototype of the Messiah, Christ, and that he was put to death by the Jewish king Aristobulus. I can't say that. The second. Jesus, therefore, was only a reincarnation of the teacher of righteousness. Thus, Christianity is denied any originality. The theological and scholarly world was recently aroused by press dispatches from England purporting to report radio talks by Mr. Alghero of the University of Manchester. It's Allegro, sorry. Allegro, in his radio talk, is supposed to have said that the teacher of righteousness was crucified by Alexander Jannaeus. I may in the future read some of Allegro's work because he's one of the earlier critics, but he was kind of a lunatic. I think he was the one who was saying that the Christianity was started by people on mushrooms and really weird stuff. He kind of gave himself a bad name because he had just really wild ideas, but some of his work might be interesting to go over. But anyway, we'll continue on here. Uh, Allegro in his radio talk is supposed to have said that the teacher of righteousness was crucified by Alexander Jannaeus, the father of Archibald II, and that when the king left, the disciples returned, took down the body of their teacher, and settled down to await his return. These pronouncements created a uh, furor among the theologians. The uniqueness of Jesus was at stake. As a matter of fact, some Christian liberals, basing themselves on the theories of DuPont Summers and now on the statements of Allegro, dared to maintain that Jesus was not unique and therefore not divine. I was highly skeptical and incredulous of these assertions attributed to Mr. Allegro, since I know from my studies of the history of the Second Jewish Commonwealth that at the time of Alexander Jannaeus, there had been no Jew who claimed himself to be a Messiah. Indeed, the idea of Messianism had not yet penetrated Judaism. The apocalyptic Pharisaic sect, which originated the idea of a Messiah as a supernatural person and which were the forerunners of Christianity, came into being after the time of Alexander Jannaeus. I don't remember if I mentioned this, but Solomon Zeitlin, he's also a Jew, and he really does not like Christianity, and that comes off in his writings here. But I'm not going to point out every time he says something I strongly disagree. Just because I don't point it out doesn't mean I'm in agreement or anything, but just use a little common sense that I think this guy's an idiot on a lot of issues, but we'll continue. In order to verify the accuracy of the press reports attributed to Mr. Allegro, I asked the British Broadcasting Company to be kind enough to send me a transcript of the 3 lectures delivered by Allegro on the 16th, 23rd, and 30th of January 1956, and they complied with my request. After receiving the transcripts of Mr. Allegro's talk, I found that he had been correctly quoted in the press. Mr. Allegro said in his second lecture that many Jews whom he defines as our sect had fled from Jerusalem. The exodus, he declared, was organized and led by a priest whom they called the teacher of righteousness. Hardly a decade after they had established themselves in their simple buildings at Qumran. He continued, the terrible Jannaeus, the wicked priest as they call him, stormed down to their new home, dragged forth the teacher, and as now seems probable, gave him into the hands of the Gentile troops to be crucified. He further asserted that the members of the community took down the broken body of their master to stand guard over it until the judgment day. If all these statements which Allegro made were indeed found in the scrolls discovered near the Dead Sea, the Christian theologians had genuine reason to become disturbed, because this would make Jesus merely an echo of the teacher of righteousness. As a matter of fact, his colleagues of the Palestinian Archaeological Museum at Jerusalem, who themselves are priests, became very fearful of the consequence. I'm pretty sure Allegro is the only non-Catholic guy on the team, the early team working on the scrolls, but we'll continue on. Where did I leave off? Became very fearful of the consequences which might be caused by Allegro's statement. They sent a letter to the London Times, which was published March 16th, 1956, wherein they denied the allegations made by Allegro. They said, "There are no unpublished texts at the disposal of Mr. Allegro other than those in which the originals are at present in the Palestine Archaeological Museum. We are unable to see in the text the findings of Mr. Allegro. We find no crucifixion of the teacher, no disposition from the cross, and no broken body of their master, to be stood guard over until Judgment Day." Mr. Allegro replied to the accusations of his colleagues and sent me a copy of a letter which he forwarded to the Times, wherein he admitted that his statements were based on inference. He said any such reconstruction must of necessity be based largely on inference. He further maintained years ago it was suggested by scholars that the teacher was expected to rise again as the priestly Messiah. Upon careful examining the transcripts of Mr. Allegro's talk, I have concluded that his statements are purely fanciful, and that we may stamp them as inventions. Alexander Jannaeus is not mentioned in the scrolls at all. Father Devoe and his associates were right when in the above mentioned letter they said that there is no mention in the scrolls of the teacher who was crucified by Alexander Jannaeus. From the readings of the transcripts of Mr. Allegro's talk, it is clear that he based some of his assertions on the fragment of a scroll which the Palestinian Museum bought from a Bedouin in 1950 and which was published by D. Bartholomew and J. T. Mellick in Qumran Cave 1. It is further evident that he misunderstood the Hebrew text when he said that this scroll contained doctrines in phraseology strikingly reflected in the New Testament. In the following pages, I have endeavored to demonstrate that this scroll was composed sometime during the Karaite period. I do not believe that the entire blame for sensationalism and falsification of history by misinterpretation of the Hebrew text and the scrolls should be placed on Mr. Allegro. He merely followed suit. All the writers who assumed the antiquity of the scrolls did not support themselves on historical evidence, but based their conclusions on inference. In many instances, they misunderstood the Hebrew text. The blame should rest on them. Their assertions about the Essenes and the teacher of righteousness are not based on any documents. The so-called Dead Sea Scrolls were composed sometime between the 7th and 12th century. Some were written in the early part of the 7th century, when the Persians defeated the armies of the Eastern Roman Empire and conquered Palestine with the help of the Jews. The Jews had expected the Persians. I think I said Palestine earlier, but no, I did say Palestine because it says Palestine. The Jews had expected the Persians to declare Palestine a Jewish state, and indeed, for a time, ruled over Jerusalem. The victory for the Persians over the Romans, who were called Kittim, greatly exalted the Jews, and they expected their Messiah. It had been stated in the Midrash of the Midrash of Lamentations, a work of the 3rd century CE. I think it's only retards say CE. AD's much better. In the name of Rabbi Simeon, that when the Persian horses, cavalry, would be in the land of Israel, the arrival of the Messiah could be expected. The Jews, however, were greatly disappointed a few years later. Heraclius, I'm probably butchering names, but the king of the Eastern Roman Empire reconquered Palestine, the Jews were persecuted and many were put to death by the Christian conquerors. Others, to save themselves, went into hiding in caves. The rule of the Byzantines after the victory of the Persians did not last long. Before the end of the first half of the 7th century, the Arabs had conquered Palestine. The advent of Muhammad, who proclaimed himself the prophet of Allah, and the great victories of the gotta sit up. Oh, I lost my spot. Let's back up a little bit. The advent of Muhammad, who proclaimed himself the prophet of Allah, and the great victories of the Arabic tribes over such great empires as the Byzantine and the Persians stirred the imagination of the Jews and gave impetus to the appearance of messiahs. One of these alleged messiahs was Abu Isa, who gathered an army of more than of more than I lost my spot. That's what I get for burping randomly. Who gathered an army more than 10,000 men and declared war against local Muslim government. There was another messiah named Yudgan at the beginning of the 8th century, and many of his followers did not eat meat or drink wine. There was another well-organized ascetic sect who called themselves mourners for Zion. Some of the supposed Dead Sea Scrolls were written at the time of the Persian conquest of Palestine, and others were written after the rise of Islam. There's a great affinity between the ideas, words, and phrases found in the scrolls and those recorded in the early Quranic literature. The laws referred to in the scrolls are also parallel to those recorded in early Quranic literature. Did I just read that again? Hence, it is evident that some of the scrolls are representative of a ascending group of Quranic sect. The erroneous assessment of the scrolls by the archaeologists to the pre-Christian period should serve as a lesson. When there is an abundance of literature material, archaeologists should familiarize themselves first with the literary material before making an ex cathedra statement about archaeological discoveries. The deluge of articles and books written on the scrolls has revealed the deplorable state of much of modern scholarship. It has shown the meagerness of knowledge on the part of both Jewish and Christian scholars of Judaism before the Christian era and the first 2 centuries thereafter, as well as rabbinic and medieval literature. It is evident from their writings that the history and development of Jewish law is a terra incognita to them. The renderings of the scrolls by Brownlee Burroughs and DuPont Summers are faulty. I propound some vital questions in these pages which Professor Albright, Burroughs, Yaden, and the Archbishop should answer. By doing so, they will facilitate not only the establishment of the date of the composition of the scrolls, but also remove the cloud of mystery that has shrouded their discovery. This is not the first time scholars have erred in regard to discoveries. They were deceived by the forgeries of Abraham Frickwick. One scholar, Harkavy, had the courage to brand them as forgeries. Again, they were deceived by the forgeries of Shapira. Claremont Ganneau was alone in recognizing that they were forgeries. These two scholars who had the courage to defy the rest of the scholarly world were insulted by their opponents. To some extent, both of these scholars were my teachers. Not long ago, the scholarly world was again deceived by a claim subsequent to the discovery of the so-called uh, Slavonic Josephus. It too was advertised as revolutionizing our knowledge of early Christianity and of the life of Jesus. For a time, I stood alone in combating this false assertion. Opposing me were eminent scholars, including my own teacher, Solomon Reinach. It is now recognized that the Slavonic Josephus was a hoax. In including this introduction, I would like to comment on the Dropsy College and the Jewish Quarterly Review, one of the great institutions of scholarship, and the other in organ of learning. In my struggle over the authenticity of the Slavonic Josephus, great pressure was exerted on Dr. Cyrus Abler, who was then president of the college, editor of the Jewish Quarterly Review, to silence me. But, believing in academic freedom, he did not yield to that pressure. At a time when pressure is increasingly exerted on the colleges of our land toward conformity, and when nonconformity is somewhat regarded as heresy, it is fortunate for scholarship that the Dropsy College is under the presidency of Dr. Abraham A. Newman, who is a staunch adherent to the great principle of academic freedom. The Dropsy College has not interfered with my writings for the Jewish Quarterly Review and my contentions against the delusions which have grown up in connection with the Dead Sea Scrolls. This book is based primarily on articles which have appeared in the Jewish Quarterly Review because of the high cost of printing. I have made no changes in the text. In many of the pages, the reader will find a certain amount of polemic utterances and much repetitionness. This is unavoidable because of the subject matter and the manner of composition. I trust the readers will be patient. And that will be the end of the introduction, which took a lot longer than I thought. But yeah, we're going to go through this book, examine his arguments, and weigh in what makes sense, what doesn't, and whether we should reconsider some of his argumentation. But yeah, we'll see where this leads.